So today, we are diving into a topic that really remains stubbornly relevant to understanding the modern Middle East, and it is again Crhstian Zionism. And I want to start by challenging a common assumption that support for Israel among Western nations, particularly Britain historically and America today, is purely about geopolitics, oil, strategic interest, which we all acknowledge. That is only part of a story. And I also want to add something about the fact that in Italy, this is a little-known phenomenon, probably because we live in a Catholic context and we are not familiar with the evangelical theology in relation to the second coming of Jesus, which I will discuss later. And this is very unfortunate, as I believe our policymakers, those that work for humanitarian organizations and the general public would benefit from this knowledge. It would fill relevant gaps in the understanding of at least American support for Israel. So the reality is that religious beliefs, specifically Christian religious conviction, has been woven into Western policy towards Palestine for centuries, and you had just heard that, and its influence is far from over. And here I would recommend some authors, particularly good friend and colleague, Lorenzo Camel, who is at the University of Turin, who published both in English and Italian, and also Gabriel Polli, a young scholar who published a great book about Victorian England and Palestine, and obviously that book is in English. Now, before I proceed, let me give some sense of historiography too. So for decades, the dominant narratives about, for instance, the Balfour Declaration and British Palestine policy focused, as Adela mentioned, almost exclusively on strategic imperatives: securing the Suez Canal, protecting routes to India, managing post-Ottoman territorial arrangements. What is interesting, there was a book published in 1956 by a woman, Barbara Tuchman, and my view is that she was not taken seriously because she was a woman in 1956. And she talked about the role of religion. Now, it's only nowadays that we see other scholars that Arya mentioned, that we see this resurgence of including religion into a broader discussion about Britain in Palestine. Is that it? No. Now, my argument is not that we should replace strategic, economic, or political explanation with religious ones. In fact, I'm not looking for the proverbial smoking gun, which does not exist. Rather, I suggest that religious conviction provided an essential framework within which other considerations operated. Palestine did not exist in their minds as a real place, with real people. It was replaced by the Holy Land, an imaginary land and landscape conjured mostly in the Middle Ages in Europe and superimposed upon the actual territory, one that didn't have borders, for instance. Now, my methodological approach draws on extensive research in archives like War Cabinet minutes, Lloyd George, Balfour personal correspondence, London Jewish Society records, military chaplain reports, which are very interesting. Obviously combined with, and this was an effort, at least for me, the close readings of theological text and also missionary publications. And I'm particularly interested in what we might call the agency of individual character, so what people do, operating within specific historical circumstances. So the questions are, how did personal religious convictions intersect with political opportunities? Where did theological frameworks enable or constrain policy options? Now, when we think about the pivotal moments that shaped modern Palestine, again, the Balfour Declaration on November 17, the British capture of Jerusalem just weeks later, all of these come immediately to mind because it's a key point in the history of the region and of the city. But here is what often gets overlooked. These were not just strategic military decisions. They emerged from deeply embedded religious imagination, transnational evangelical networks spanning Britain and America, including also crusading rhetoric, portraying the Palestine campaign as a fulfilling medieval Christian ambitions, And also I want to add here a movement that was known as British Israelism that mystically connected Britain to biblical Israel. Now, I really am not going to discuss this last one. It was a tiny mystical movement which did not play any significant role, but it's fair to mention that in those years had their 15 minutes of fame around that period of time. Now, these networks created fundamental contradiction. Christian Zionism supported Jewish restoration to the Holy Land, while crusading imagery emphasized Christian dominance. They provided theological justification for Jewish return, while seeing themselves as the true inheritors of biblical promises. There are some issues here. And here is why this matters today. These religious networks did not disappear with the end of the British Empire. They transformed, they migrated across the Atlantic, and they continue. As of today, the current American ambassador to Israel is one of them, to shape American evangelical support for Israel in ways that direct influence contemporary Middle Eastern politics, financial ways too. Now, this is a bit of an interesting picture I found online. This is Benjamin Netanyahu in some 15th century, 16th century clothes, and I'll get there in a minute. So let me take you back to 17th century England, before what Ari was talking about, the Puritans, hardline Protestants trying to eliminate every trace of Catholicism from the Church of England. And they developed a fascinating obsession with Old Testament narratives. Why? Because they saw parallel between England's struggles against Catholic powers and ancient Israel's story. Now, here is something crucial to understand about Crhstian Zionism, which of course was not called Crhstian Zionism back then, but as Ari mentioned earlier. And it starts with a simple theological question. God promised Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan, right? We're all familiar with that. Bible, Genesis. But here's the thing. That promise was never entirely fulfilled. The Jews never occupied all the territory promised to them, and their possession of the land has never been continuous. We all know the story from the Bible. Medieval Catholic theology had a straightforward answer to that. The Jewish nation had ceased to exist. As we would say in America, capiche, finito. They had no further significance in God's plan. Essentially, the Jews were unnecessary. Sorry about that. The Jews had been punished for rejecting Christ. End of story. And this is what scholars call supersessionist theology. The idea that the Christian church had replaced Israel in God's covenant. But here's the caveat now. The Puritans began to challenge this. They argued that biblical prophecies actually promise Jewish restoration to Palestine as a precondition for the second coming of Christ. Now, I know my audience, and I know many of you have no idea what I'm talking about. So I need to pause here to explain what this idea means for those who are not aware. Because this theological difference is fundamental to understanding everything that follows. For Catholics and other Christian denominations, the second coming cannot, and I stress this, cannot be predicted. That's why it's not an issue. That's why we don't talk about it. That's why if anyone's going to a Catholic church, this is a non-issue. It does simply not exist. In fact, it would be useless to try. Some people try to talk about it, but again, it's simple. Gospel of Matthew provides an interesting description of the second coming, but it is also clear, Matthew 24:36, quote, "No one knows, not even the angels, nor the Son, but the Father's only." End of story, once again. Evangelicals believe, on the other hand, that the gathering of the Jews in the land of Israel will trigger the second coming, which eventually will see, and again I'm asking you to think about this as a real situation, something that according to them will happen, the rapture. So the skies will open half of the Jews will die and the other half will convert. And I hope you're going to be the one who's going to convert. It's a little anti-Semitic, wouldn't you agree? But that's not the point. Well, it will be in a second. And after that, it will be the new era of Christ. And I'm going to repeat this. Some statistics say about 80 million to 100 million Americans believe in this. The current ambassador of the United States to Israel is a proponent of this idea. Okay, so math, 2 + 2 = 4, you can see the connection between this theology and the political relationship between Israel and the United States of America. Of course, there's also strategic issues, or whatever you want, but this is important. Now, this eschatological framework, so this theology of end of times, became what I call a theological template that would persist for centuries. Ari is right, ups and downs. It's not a linear, it's not a line, but there are connections. And it made Christian support for Jewish restoration theologically necessary rather than merely a charitable or a strategic, question. So this was radical material, and it started having real-world consequences during Oliver Cromwell's rule in the 1650s. And so here you have Benjamin Netanyahu, Oliver Cromwell coming together. Cromwell, influenced by these Puritan discussions and wanting to attract wealthy Jewish merchants, effectively ended the medieval ban on Jewish settlements in England that had been in place since 1290, so much for Judeo-Christian traditions. But more significantly, his government received petitions from English Puritans for active support for Jewish return to Palestine, which, by the way, at the time was obviously Ottoman territory. And there is an amazing petition from 1649 by 2 English Puritans, Ebenezer and Joanna Cartwright, declaring that, quote, "This nation of England, with the inhabitants of the Netherlands, shall be the first and the readiest to transport Israel's sons and daughters in their ships to the land promised to their forefathers." So think about that for a moment. In the middle of the 17th century, English Protestants were already imagining themselves as instruments of Jewish restoration to Palestine. The idea that England had a special role in fulfilling biblical prophecy became embedded in Protestant political culture. Again, a sort of a theological template for understanding England's mission in the world. Now, these ideas went dormant for a while after Cromwell died, but they did not disappear. They persisted in dissenting religious communities, basically waiting for the right moment to resurface. And this happened in what we call non-denominational churches. And the moment came in the early 1800s when, following Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, which then was followed by Muhammad or Mehmet Ali's rule, the Middle East basically opened up to European penetration. And suddenly, Palestine, the Holy Lands, became accessible in ways that it had not been for centuries. And this is where we see what we historians may call the opening of the East to European influence. And religious networks were among the first to take advantage of this. In 1809, a group of British evangelicals founded the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, also known London Jewish Society, and their goals were fascinating and contradictory. Preach that Jesus was the Messiah to Jews, encourage physical restoration of Jews to Palestine, and teach Christians about their Jewish roots, and also generally promote the Christian Jewish movement. Here's the irony. They were terrible at converting Jews. In fact, in the first 13 years, they averaged maybe 7 Jewish converts per year, and none of them were religious leaders. So we have some research done on that by a colleague, Yaron Peres, that looked at British missions to Jews in 19th century Palestine and basically documented all of this, giving us a sense that this mission failed in this objective. But here is what they were good at: building institutions in Palestine. So they established an Anglican bishopric in Jerusalem in 1841, founded schools, built hospitals. And all of these institutions created permanent bases on ongoing relationships with both Jewish and Arab communities. Now, this picture is from Christ Church in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there are two Anglican churches. This is the, shall I say, pro-Israel one. The other one is pro-Palestinian, to use this terminology. But you can see the connection. So the Alpha and the Omega, but also Emmanuel, written in Hebrew characters, and the Star of David. So a clear connection between Christianity and Judaism. And this is where things get interesting for our story. These institutions became valuable sources of intelligence and political influence. They were not just missionary outposts, they were nodes in a transnational network that would eventually influence empire policy. The missionary correspondence I have looked at in the archive shows regular reporting on political conditions, economic developments, demographic changes, all flowing back to London and informing British understanding of Palestine. And the key figure here, again, is Lord Shaftesbury, a social reformer and Tory MP, and in the, the mid-1800s or the 1850s. Shaftesbury declared that he was, quote, always moved in his life by the principle of a second coming. This was not just personal piety, it was a systematic theological framework that viewed British imperial expansion as fulfilling divine purposes. But, and this is crucial, Shaftesbury opposed Jewish emancipation in Britain. So he supported Jewish restoration to Palestine while being, in some sense, anti-Semitic. This contradiction would characterize Crhstian Zionism, again, it's a term that was coined later, fought throughout its development. Simultaneous support for Jewish restoration and underlining anti-Semitic assumptions about Jews' place in Christian society. By the late 1800s, you had figures, like we saw earlier, Lawrence Oliphant, becoming strong advocates for Jewish resettlement in Palestine. Oliphant wrote books that would later influence Theodor Herzl and other Zionist leaders. So Crhstian Zionism was already creating intellectual frameworks the secular Zionism would build upon. A point often, in my view, overlooked in standard history of Zionism that focused primarily on Jewish agency. I would add here the Christian one. Now, this was not just a British phenomenon. By the 1840s, similar societies to the London Jew Society operated in Basel, Berlin, across North America, mostly in the Northeast. So we are talking about an evangelical international, sharing personnel, funding, theological frameworks, all of them across borders. American evangelical leaders like William Blackstone were developing their own arguments for Jewish restoration. In 1891, Blackstone circulated a petition supporting Jewish restoration that was signed by prominent, this is a very interesting point, industrialists and politicians, including Rockefeller, John Rockefeller, Cyrus McCormick. So think about that. Major American business leaders signing a petition based on biblical prophecy about restoring Jews to Palestine. And this created what Shalom Goldman calls a triangular relationship between Protestant missionary societies, Jewish communities, and imperial administrators. These missionary societies were not just doing religious work. British policymakers were getting, as I mentioned earlier, detailed information about conditions in Palestine and the broader Middle East. So by the time World War I breaks out, you have this transnational evangelical infrastructure connecting Britain, America, and Palestine itself, but also theological justifications, political connection, intelligence networks, and financial resources, all of them working together. And this is what I mean by religious beliefs providing a framework. It created the channels, the relationship, the institutional structures through which information flowed and policy developed. So let's move to World War I, right? World War I begins in 1914. Britain is facing the Ottoman Empire, which controls Palestine. Now, here's where the archival research since the 1990s has significantly revised our understanding. Cabinet papers that were previously closed reveals something remarkable. When British leaders like Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and you were moving towards the end of the war, so 1917, and Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour discussed Palestine policy, they were not just talking about strategy. They were explicitly invoking Christian Zionist argument and biblical prophecy. In a crucial cabinet meeting in June 1917, Lloyd George cited biblical prophecy alongside strategic consideration, arguing that British support for Zionism would fulfill both divine will and imperial necessity. But let me tell you about Lord George's background, because this matters. He grew up in a Welsh Baptist household, and his knowledge of Palestinian geography, according to him from the Bible, was actually better than his knowledge of the Western Front. It perhaps was not an exaggeration. His maternal uncle was a member of a Welsh Baptist sect, and family correspondence preserved in the Lord George papers shows extensive discussions of prophetic interpretation and eschatological expectation. And this created interpretive frameworks that made Christian Zionist arguments appear both theological sound and politically prudent. Kenneth Morgan's biography of Lloyd George, drawing on these family papers, documents the extent to which Lloyd George's religious upbringing shaped his approach to international affairs throughout his careers. Lloyd George corresponded regularly with prominent Christian Zionist leaders like F. Meyer and J. Campbell Morgan. Meyer was a prominent Baptist minister supporting Jewish restoration that provided Lloyd George with theological arguments reinforcing his political inclination. Morgan, he was the pastor of Westminster Chapel, so offered pulpit support for government policy that helped mobilize evangelical opinion. And this was a feedback loop. Religious leaders provided theological validation for policy preferences, which then became easier to implement politically. Arthur Balfour, whose name is on the Balfour Declaration, had similar convictions, though perhaps more intellectual and less emotionally grounded than Lloyd George. His correspondence with his sister-in-law, Alice James, reveals a politician's wrestling with theological questions about Jewish restoration throughout this period. His book, The Foundation of Belief, published in 1895, shows sustained engagement with questions about religious truth and historical providence. Now, I want to address here a potential objection. Some might argue, oh, but surely these were just rhetorical flourishes. Politicians use religious language all the time, even today. We can see that. I mean, for those of us living in America, we have a Secretary of Defense, well, ideally citing from the Bible, but he prefers Quentin Tarantino. That's another story. But the point is that there is this religious rhetoric, right? And this is a fair skepticism. And it is why archival evidence is so important. These were not public statements designed for mass consumption. These were private letters, cabinet discussion, personal correspondence. And the consistency of religious framework across public and private documents suggests genuine conviction, not just mere rhetoric. Balfour's support for Zionism was not merely a political calculation. His speeches defending the declaration in Parliament emphasized moral obligation and historical debt to the Jewish people. And these were framed in explicitly religious terms. Am I missing a point here? Yeah, this one. And there is an American dimension too that deserves more attention than it usually gets. President Woodrow Wilson, he was a Presbyterian, and his conviction made him receptive to arguments about Jewish restorations in Palestine. His support for the Balfour Declaration reflected genuine theological beliefs, conviction, not just strategic calculations about Jewish voters or post-war arrangements. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and Wilson had theological education that created frameworks making Christian Zionist arguments appear, once again, both religiously sound and politically wise. The transatlantic evangelical network supporting Zionism created what we might call a religious international that transcended national boundaries. The Federal Council of Churches, representing major Protestant denominations in America, issued statements supporting Jewish restoration that reinforced Zionist lobbying efforts. And this created pressure on the Wilson administration that complemented British initiatives while reflecting independent American interest in Jewish restoration. And this is like, there's an American trajectory, and we might talk about that later. Now, moving away from Crhstian Zionism and bringing the same picture that Arya showed earlier, because it's an important one, alongside Crhstian Zionism, another religious narrative emerged during World War I. The idea that this was a new crusade. And this is where things get really complicated, because the two frameworks, Crhstian Zionism and crusading rhetoric, are theologically incompatible. From the very beginning of the war, Anglican bishops, nonconformist editors began framing the conflict in explicitly religious words. Arthur Winnington Ingram, Bishop of London, gave sermons in St. Paul Cathedral, which was attended by government officials and military leaders, describing British soldiers as knights of God, engaged in a sacred mission. So when British forces started succeeding against Ottoman armies in Palestine, this general crusading rhetoric became specific to the land. I want to mention here a colleague, Francesco Cutolo, who published some very important work about Italian military chaplains in Libya, showing similar patterns. So the use of crusading imagery to frame colonial campaigns, ironically even in the Italian context. The Palestinian campaign was presented in British media and from church pulpits as a fulfillment of medieval crusading ambition. British control of Jerusalem provided symbolic validations of claims about divine providence and, again, historical destiny. And here's very interesting, because we see the role of military chaplains that played a crucial role in promoting this. They were not just providing religious services, they were actively interpreting military operation through crusading frameworks. Soldiers' letters home show how pervasive this religious interpretation became. They genuinely believed they were liberating the Holy Land in a way that completed what medieval, mostly Richard the Lionheart, crusaders had failed to achieve. And the press ate this up. Newspapers ran headlines like, "The Last Crusades and Christian knights reclaim Jerusalem." But here is a problem. And this gets to the heart of my argument about contradictions. You have crusading rhetoric emphasizing Christian dominance, running alongside Crhstian Zionist rhetoric, supporting Jewish restorations. And as I said earlier, these two frameworks are theologically contradictory. So traditional crusading rhetoric portrayed Jews, it was mentioned earlier, as enemies of Christian forces. Remember, medieval crusades involved pogroms against Jewish communities in Europe and in the Holy Land. Crhstian Zionism, on the other hand, required Jewish restoration as essential to God's plan. So how do we reconcile these? The short answer, you do not. And this contradiction will haunt British policy in Palestine until the end of British rule. This is an alternative picture of that day. It's a cartooned picture of a British conquest of Jerusalem. Again, December 11, 1917, General Edmund Allenby enters Jerusalem on foot, and the timing, just weeks after the Balfour Declaration, created symbolic resonance that everyone recognized. Now, let me clarify this. This was a coincidence, it was not planning. The military timetable and the declaration's announcement were not coordinated. But obviously, the British absolutely exploited the coincidence for maximum symbolic effect. And as Arya said, and also Adele, the decision to enter on foot rather than horseback was deliberate. It was meant to show respect for the city's religious significance, to make the occupation appear as liberation rather than conquest. And documents in the War Office show that military and civilian officials planned extensively, consulting with religious authorities from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities to develop protocols that would minimize offense. But look at the international response. because this reveals how many conflicting expectations existed. European Catholic leaders, the Pope, welcomed Christian control but worried about Protestant dominance. American Protestant denominations celebrated while calling for protections of Jewish rights. Orthodox churches demanded guarantees for their traditional privileges. Last but not least, the majority of people, Muslim authorities, protested the loss of Islamic control. So every religious community had expectations about what British control would mean, and these expectations were often opposed. The British found themselves trying to satisfy multiple religious constituencies with fundamentally different visions of what Palestine should become. Now comes the hard part, actually governing Palestine. And this is where religious rhetoric collided with political reality. And our papers speak to each other here, perhaps with different views, but that's the issue. British administrators tried to reconcile Crusader imagery with practical requirements of governing a diverse population. The contradictions between supporting Jewish restoration and maintaining Christian control of holy sites created ongoing tensions. Add to this the expectation of the Arab populations, who, by the way, had not been consulted and who had their own claims to the land. And so you have a recipe for disaster. Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner, was Jewish, an attempt to show commitment to Zionist policy. But Samuel's secular orientation and commitment to impartial administration disappointed evangelical supporters who expected a more explicitly Christian approach to governing the Holy Land. The evangelical networks that had provided crucial support for the Balfour Declaration and the Jerusalem campaign started to realize that their religious expectations, whether Christian Zionist hopes or crusading fantasies, were not going to be fulfilled. And here is what nobody had anticipated: organized Arab opposition. Christian Zionist theology focused on Jewish restoration while largely ignoring Arab population, something they still do to an extent today. The religious framework literally did not have categories for understanding Arab political claims or national aspiration, not to mention to understand Christian Palestinians, Christian Arabs, that were completely alien to them. Crusading rhetoric assumed Muslim submission rather than active resistance. So the development of Palestinian Arab nationalism created complications that the religious frameworks simply had not accounted for. British officials found themselves caught between conflicting demands from religious constituencies that had provided the initial support for British involvement, and they gradually abandoned explicit religious justification for their policy. But by then, they were trapped by commitments they had made exactly based on religious expectation that they simply could not fulfill. Winston Churchill's white paper of 1922 tried to square the circle by limiting Jewish immigration while maintaining commitment to the national home. But this satisfied no one, not Zionists, no Arabs, no evangelical supporters. Each group felt betrayed because each had interpreted the original commitment through their own religious or political framework. And this is what I mean when I say the failure of British policy cannot be fully understood without recognizing how religious motivation shaped initial commitments that proved impossible to fulfill. The religious frameworks created expectation that simply political reality could not meet. So, Britain eventually leaves Palestine in 1948, empire ends, right? The religious influence is over, not even close. The transnational evangelical networks that had influenced imperial policy adapted to new realities. The theological framework developed during the imperial period became the foundation for what would become one of the most significant religious political movements of the late 20th, from the Reagan administration onwards, and early 20th century. American evangelical support for Israel. The American dimension of Crhstian Zionism, which had been developing alongside British movements since the 19th century, became particularly important after Britain's imperial decline. Right? The Titanic collapsed, and now the Americans are there. And the lobby networks that supported the Balfour Declaration provided models for American evangelical political engagement. Dispensationalist theology, I'm not going to explain, but it's essentially Crhstian Zionism, popularized through Dallas Theological Seminary and the Scofield Reference Bible, created a mass constituency for Crhstian Zionist politics that far exceeded anything achieved during the imperial period. Organizations like the Christian United for Israel, funded by John Hagee, claimed millions of members and exercised control, and still does, considerable influence over American foreign policy. Modern Crhstian Zionism operates through the same channels that characterize British Christian Zionism: personal relationships with political leaders, theological justification for political position, mobilization of religious constituencies. The emphasis on biblical prophecies and eschatological expectation has been systematized into detailed interpreted schemes that provide religious significance for contemporary political developments. What's happening in the West Bank with the settlers is partly Israeli politics, but it has a lot to do also with Christian Zionist theology of restoration of the Jews in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. So you see the marriage here. And the contradiction between Christian Zionism and anti-Semitism, it's still there, just in more complicated forms. Modern Christian Zionist movements generally repudiate explicit anti-Semitism and express strong support for Jewish welfare. But critics, including myself and other Jewish scholars and rabbis, argue that underlying theological assumption about Jewish conversion and Christian superiority persist, just in different forms. And the expectation that Jews must convert at the end of times remains part of the theological framework, even if it is not emphasized in contemporary political discourse. There's a reality in American Christian Zionist institutions where when they have to engage Jewish constituents, they avoid this part, but everybody knows about it. So, just to conclude, what's the takeaway here? First, you cannot understand modern Middle Eastern politics, particularly Western support for Israel, without understanding this religious dimension. The frameworks developed centuries ago by Puritan theologians, institutionalized by 19th century missionaries, and operationalized by 20th century British imperialists continue to shape policy today. This is not just historical curiosity, it is contemporary political reality. Second, religious conviction in politics creates particular kinds of problems. When policy commitments are justified through theological frameworks, they become rigid. They are not subject to the normal processes of strategic reassessment or compromise. You can't compromise on theology. If God tells you, God's told you. There's nothing to compromise there. They're not subject to the normal. British officials could not easily abandon commitments made in the name of fulfilling biblical prophecy, even when those commitments proved impossible to implement practically. The sacred, once again, cannot be negotiated in the same way as the strategic. Third, the gap between religious imagination and political reality often leads to contradictions and failure. The biblical Palestine imagined by Christian Zionists bore little relationship to the actual territory and the people of Palestine. When these religious visions met reality, the result was ongoing tension, violence, and eventual colonial failure. Maurice Olbach's concept of collective memory helps us understand this: the imagined landscape superimposed on the real one, creating fundamental misunderstanding. Fourth and last, these religious networks are remarkably durable. They survive imperial decline, adapt to a new political context, transform their organizational structure, but maintain core theological commitments across generations and across oceans in this case. The theological template established in the 17th century, with ups and downs, remains recognizable in 21st century American evangelical politics. So, finally, the past is not past. It is present, transformed but persistent, shaping our world in ways that we do not recognize. For those of us working on Palestine, Israel, for policymakers, for anyone trying to understand why certain political positions seem so intractable, understanding this religious dimension is not optional, it is essential. Thank you.